2 young troublemakers grabbed an old soldier's inhaler while he was having a bad asthma attack. They thought nobody would dare interfere, but the Royal Guard had been observing, and what occurred next shocked everyone in the crowd. This is the story. But before we go on, please tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Subscribe to the channel if you respect the Royal Guards. The evening's darkness was getting longer across the area near Buckingham Palace as the final light of the summer sun shone on the fancy gates. Among the smaller number of visitors, Arthur Bennet was walking slowly. His face, lined with age, showed the quiet pride of his 65 years. His Royal Air Force Veterans Badge reflected the dimming light as he stopped to get his breath back, one hand moving, without thinking, to the inhaler in his coat pocket. Guard Robert was standing in his position, his red uniform a bright spot of colour against the grey stone of the palace. At 28, he stood like someone who knew the importance of the tradition he was part of. His eyes, well trained from years in the military, noticed everything, including the slight wheezing in Mr. Bennet's breathing and the 2 people who seemed unusually interested in the old soldier. Freddie Smith and Pete Jones were leaning against a nearby wall, their costly sports clothes and new trainers not matching their aggressive attitude. Freddie, the taller one, pushed his friend as Mr. Bennet went by. "Look at this old bloke," he said, his voice clearly showing he was from a rough part of London. "Bet that badge is valuable." Pete's eyes became smaller, noticing the small shake in Mr. Bennet's movements, the way his hand kept going to his pocket. "Looks like he has 2, he whispered back. "Medicine, probably. These old guys always have something worth taking on them." Mr. Bennet felt them looking, but he carried on walking. His training from years ago warned him of possible danger. The air felt heavy in his lungs, and he could feel an asthma attack starting, the worst possible time. His fingers touched the inhaler in his pocket, making sure it was there. Guard Robert was not moving, but his focus had increased. From years of standing guard, he'd learnt to spot the clues of a coming problem. The way Freddie and Pete had changed their position, their careful placing to block Mr. Bennet's route. These weren't normal tourists looking at the palace. These were bullies who'd seen what they thought was a simple target. The other visitors walked around as usual, taking pictures and looking at their guidebooks, not aware of the trouble that was starting. But there was a feeling of worry in the air now, a quiet energy that made parents bring their children closer and couples walk faster as they went past the 2 young men. Mr. Bennet's wheezing was louder now, each breath a clear effort that made his shoulders move up and down with difficulty. The evening air, though not cold, seemed to get stuck in his throat as his airways tightened. The familiar pressure in his chest showed the start of an asthma attack, something he'd had since his time in the service. "Having trouble, old man?" Freddie's voice was heard across the area, deliberately loud so people would notice. He and Pete had moved closer, their actions easy but planned, like wolves going after an injured animal. "Looking a bit unwell, aren't you?" Mr. Bennet's hand went to his coat pocket again, fingers wrapping around the inhaler. Years of being a soldier had taught him to keep calm when things were bad, but his body was failing him. Each step was harder as he tried to stay upright while struggling to breathe. "Maybe he needs our help, Freddie," Pete shouted, his fake worry not deceiving anyone. "Looks like he has something important in that pocket he keeps touching." Their words had a sharp edge that made nearby tourists walk quicker, parents guiding their children towards the palace gates with worried looks over their shoulders. Guard Robert stood still, but his skilled eye saw every small thing. The small shake in Mr. Bennet's hands, the growing worry in his breathing, the hunting grace in Freddie and Pete's steps. His own breathing stayed steady, controlled, as he saw the space between them get smaller. "Hey, soldier!" Freddie called out again, nearer now. "RAF, is it? Must have been a hero back then." His voice was full of mockery as he pointed towards Mr. Bennet's service badge. "A bit too old now, though, aren't you?" Mr. Bennet tried to stand straighter, his pride as a soldier fighting with his body's weakness. His fingers gripped the inhaler, knowing he'd need it soon, but not wanting to appear weak in front of these circling attackers. Each breath was shorter than the one before, the familiar fear of an asthma attack growing in his chest. "Look at him, Pete." Freddy's voice was lower, meant for his friend, but loud enough to be heard. "Think whatever he's got in that pocket might be worth grabbing." They were on either side of Mr. Bennet now, their steps skilled, in sync, clearly not the first time they'd picked on someone weak. A young couple stopped close by, the man stepping forward a bit, as if to help, but Pete's quick, threatening look made them hurry off. The other tourists had moved away from the area, their holiday pictures forgotten as they watched the situation with increasing worry. Mr. Bennet's sight started to go blurry at the sides, his lungs struggling for air. The inhaler was a comforting weight in his pocket, but getting it now, he knew, would just show his weakness to these bullies. His military training told him to stay alert, but the increasing lack of air made everything feel far away, like a dream. "Time for a friendly word, I think," Freddy said, his smile not reaching his eyes, as he and Pete closed in on their victim. "Let's see what you have in that pocket, old man." Freddy stepped right in front of Mr. Bennet, making him stop. His taller height let him stand over the old soldier, whose breathing was now clearly difficult. Pete went around the back, blocking any way out. "I'm just trying to go home," Mr. Bennet managed to say between difficult breaths, his soldier's manner still there despite his trouble. The RAF badge on his coat reflected the fading light as his chest moved up and down with effort. Freddy's face twisted into a mocking smile. "Oh, we'll assist you to go home, right after you give us whatever it is you keep holding in that pocket." He got closer, deliberately going into Mr. Bennet's space. "Must be something valuable, the way you're protecting it." A small group of tourists had stopped to look, their faces showing a mix of worry and not knowing what to do. A middle-aged woman stepped forward, her British accent clear with firmness. "Leave him be. Can't you tell he's not well?" "Keep out of this, love," Pete said sharply, his voice threatening enough to make her move back. "Just having a nice chat with our old soldier here." His eyes stayed on Mr. Bennet as he finished getting into position beside him. Mr. Bennet's soldier training was battling with his body's urgent need for air. He could feel the asthma attack getting worse, his airways closing more with each moment. The inhaler in his pocket seemed very heavy, but getting it now would just give these bullies what they wanted. 30 years, Royal Air Force," Mr. Bennet got out, wheezing, trying to get some kind of respect or love for his country across. "Please, I need to—" 30 years, Freddy interrupted with a harsh laugh. "Well, look at you now, hero. Can't even breathe properly." He looked at Guard Roberts' position, then back to Mr. Bennet with a sneer. "At least you're not standing around like a statue, pretending to do something useful." Guard Roberts stayed still, but his eyes followed every move. Years of fighting had taught him to understand situations, to see actions before they occurred. The way Freddy's weight moved, how Pete's hands stayed loose at his sides. These weren't ordinary thugs. They'd done this before. "Maybe if you ask politely," Pete teased, getting closer to Mr. Bennet's right side. "We'll let you keep your precious badge after we're finished. A bit of respect for your time in the service and all that." His laugh had no humor, only cruelty. Mr. Bennet's sight was starting to go dark at the edges, the lack of air becoming very serious. His hand moved, without him meaning it, towards his pocket again. A move that his attackers noticed. "There it is again." Freddy's voice went down to a risky whisper. "Whatever you have in there must be really valuable." He got even nearer, his breath warm on Mr. Bennet's face, and, "Let's have a look, shall we?" The other tourists had moved further back, making a loose circle around the scene. A dad covered his young son's eyes, hurrying him towards the gates. An American couple filmed quietly on their phone, but a hard look from Pete made them put it down quickly. "Please," Mr. Bennet managed, his breathing now worryingly weak. "I require my medication." "Medicine?" Freddy's eyes became bright with nasty interest. "Well, why didn't you tell us?" He looked at Pete, who nodded with the same cruelty. "We should definitely examine that. Wouldn't want you using something harmful, would we?" Guard Robert's perfect stance hid the ready-for-a-fight tension in his body. Every instinct, sharpened through years of military experience, told him the situation was going to get worse. His formal duty kept him still, but his mind was already working out distances, angles, reaction times. "Final chance, old man." Freddy's voice became hard as Mr. Bennet wobbled slightly, struggling for air. "Show us what you've got, or we'll have to take it ourselves." Freddy's hand moved out with practiced speed, grabbing Mr. Bennet's coat and pulling him forward. The sudden pull made the old soldier fall, his already difficult breathing becoming more desperate. Pete moved in smoothly, his hands quickly finding and emptying Mr. Bennet's pocket. "Well, well." Pete held up the inhaler, turning it in the dim light. "What's this? Seems costly." His fingers went around the medical item as Mr. Bennet struggled to stay standing, one hand holding his chest. "Return that," Mr. Bennet wheezed, years of military leadership trying to come into his voice despite his failing breath. I can't." His words became a series of desperate gasps that made him hold on to a nearby barrier for support. "You need it?" Freddy's voice was sing-song as he watched Mr. Bennet struggle. "Should have asked nicely, shouldn't you?" He nodded to Pete, who started throwing the inhaler from hand to hand like a child's plaything. "Maybe we can sort something out? What's it worth to you?" Mr. Bennet's knees started to give way, his face going a worrying grey colour. His RAF badge shone as his chest moved with more and more useless tries to get air. "Please," he managed, the word barely heard. "Combat veteran. 30 years. Combat veteran." Freddy's laugh was sharp and nasty. "Look at you now, tough man. Can't even stay standing." He got closer, deliberately going into Mr. Bennet's space again. "All those awards and honors, and here you are begging street kids for your medicine." Guard Robert's eyes hadn't moved, but every muscle in his body was tight, like a spring. Through his side vision, he could see Mr. Bennet's condition getting worse quickly. The old soldier's lips were starting to go blue, a dangerous sign he knew from his medical training. "Might be worth something," Pete said thoughtfully, still playing with the inhaler. "These things aren't cheap, are they? Military pension must be good for something." He held it just out of Mr. Bennet's reach, watching the older man's desperate tries to get it. Mr. Bennet's legs finally gave way, making him fall to his knees on the courtyard stones. His fingers scratched against the ground as he tried to stay awake, each breath a terrible, wheezing struggle that got weaker every second. Years of military experience flashed through his mind. Awards, ceremonies, fighting missions, the Queen's honors, all reduced to this moment of being unable to help himself. "Not so important now, are you?" Freddy crouched down next to Mr. Bennet, his voice full of fake worry. "All that serving, all that responsibility, and look how it finishes, on your knees, begging people like us for help." He grabbed Mr. Bennet's chin, making the old soldier look at him. "This is what occurs when you get old, hero. The world changes, leaves you behind." Guard Robert's fingers had gone white on his weapon, but his training kept him steady. Every part of him shouted to step in, but years of good behavior kept him still, waiting for the correct moment. He could see Mr. Bennet's condition getting to a critical point. He'd need to act soon, and it would need to be decisive. "Maybe we should return it," Pete said with pretend thoughtfulness, still holding the inhaler out of reach. "What do you reckon, Freddy? Has he understood his lesson about walking around here like he's important?" "Don't know." Freddy stood up, looking down at Mr. Bennet's fallen shape. "Still seems a bit proud to me. Still wearing that uniform in his mind, is he? Maybe needs to know how the world really is now." His foot pushed Mr. Bennet's side, Not quite a kick, but a clear threat of worse to follow. Mr. Bennet's sight was starting to go dark at the edges, his desperate gasps getting weaker. The world had become smaller, just the sight of his inhaler in Pete's hand, so close, but impossible to reach in his current state. His soldier's pride had gone, replaced by the basic need to survive, but even that didn't seem to matter anymore. The evening air had become colder. Or maybe it was just the lack of air making everything feel far away and freezing. Freddie and Pete's teasing voices seemed to come from far away now, their nasty laughter mixing with the worried whispers of the helpless crowd. As Mr. Bennet's awareness started to go, his last clear thought was of the unfairness surviving fighting, only to meet this end on the very ground he'd promised to defend. 30 years of service, Freddie told the horrified people watching, and all it gets you is this. With clear cruelty, he grabbed the inhaler from Pete's hand and held it in front of Mr. Bennet's face. The old soldier's eyes, now dull with lack of air, followed the life-saving item with desperate focus. Mr. Bennet tried to reach for it, his movements becoming clumsy as his body fought for air. His lips had gone a worrying blue color, each breath now a small, useless gasp that hardly moved his chest. Decades of soldiers' conduct had been brought down to this, lying on the courtyard stones, at the mercy of two cruel attackers. Please. The word was almost silent, more mouthed than spoken. Mr. Bennet's hand shook in the air between them, reaching for the inhaler that Freddie now held just inches from his face. Listen to that. Freddie's voice was full of theatrical disappointment. Still hasn't learnt good manners, has he? With planned cruelty, he lowered the inhaler to the ground. Maybe this will help the lesson to be learned. The sound of plastic breaking under Freddie's shoe cut through the evening air like a gunshot. Mr. Bennet's eyes became wide in horror as he saw his lifeline being squashed into useless bits, pieces of the inhaler going across the stones like sharp pieces of metal. Oops! Freddie twisted his heel, crushing the other pieces into dust. Seems like someone's going to have a bad night. He kicked the broken remains towards Mr. Bennet's face, watching as the old soldier's struggles got weaker. Pete laughed, but there was a new edge to it. Even he seemed worried by how far things had gone. Mate, maybe we should... Should what? Freddie turned on his friend. Show kindness. Like the world shows any of us kindness. He turned back to Mr. Bennet, whose desperate gasps had become worryingly quiet. This is what occurs when you're no longer useful, old man. Nobody's coming to rescue you, not your precious RAF, not these watching tourists, not anyone. The crowd had got bigger but stayed unable to help, held back by fear and not knowing what to do. Parents covered their children's eyes, tourists put down their cameras in shame, and a general feeling of horror came over the group like a heavy cover. Mr. Bennet's awareness was going fast. The world had become small points of light in a darkening emptiness, each failed breath bringing him closer to the end. His military training, his fighting experience, his years of service, none of it was important in the face of this basic animal need for air. Guard Robert stood in his position, his appearance a perfect example of formal discipline. But behind that mask of stillness, every fighting-trained instinct was shouting. He could see Mr. Bennet's condition getting worse every second, could see the signs of coming collapse in the old soldier's weakening struggles. Look at him now, Freddie carried on teasing, going around Mr. Bennet's fallen shape like a hunting bird. This is what all your service gets you. Passing away on the street while people look, while your fancy guard stands there not doing anything. He spat on the ground near Mr. Bennet's face. Some protection they offer, eh? Mr. Bennet's hand dropped weakly to his side, his struggles becoming very small. The darkness was closing in, each heartbeat banging in his ears as his body fought its losing fight for oxygen. His dimming eyes found Guard Robert's post, and something like shared knowledge passed between them, soldier to soldier, across years of service. The evening sun had gone below the palace walls, making long shadows across the courtyard. In the growing darkness, nobody saw the small change in Guard Robert's stance, the tiny tightening of muscles, the small change of his grip, the ready-for-a-fight placing of his feet, the calm before the storm. The change from formal statue to fighting soldier occurred in a moment. Guard Robert's movement was a fast blur of red and sharp action as he went across the courtyard, his formal weapon held across his back with practiced skill. Years of special forces training took over, turning his dress uniform into fighting gear. Before Freddy could fully understand the movement, a white-gloved hand grabbed his shoulder with strong force. The grip showed countless hours of combat training, each finger placed to give maximum control with the least effort. Freddy's sneer stopped on his face as he was turned around with military accuracy. "What the?" His words were cut off as Robert's other hand moved out, catching his throat in a precise hold that wasn't quite a choke, but had the clear promise of becoming one. The guard's eyes, no longer looking straight ahead, looked into Freddy's with the focus of a fighting veteran. Pete started to move forward, but stopped as Robert's boot hit the back of Freddy's knee, making him fall to the ground with a controlled force that showed a lot of close fighting experience. The action was smooth, economical, and completely decisive. "Stay exactly where you are." Robert's voice had the clear command tone of someone used to being obeyed in life-or-death situations. Pete's hands went up without him thinking, survival instinct recognizing real authority. Without letting go of his hold on Freddy, Robert reached into his uniform pocket and got out a spare inhaler standard kit for guards trained to help with medical problems. His movement towards Mr. Bennett was precise and controlled, keeping Freddy held down while covering the distance to the veteran in 2 efficient steps. "RAF command, sir." Robert's voice was clear as he pushed the inhaler into Mr. Bennett's shaking hand. "Deep breath on my count." The military procedure seemed to get through Mr. Bennett's air-starved confusion, decades of service responding to the chain of command. Freddy tried to break free, but Robert's grip tightened with crushing force. "Try that again." The guard's voice was very quiet and dangerous. "And you'll find out exactly what ceremonial means in the Queen's Guard." There was nothing formal in his tone, or the way his fingers found pressure points that made Freddy gasp. Mr. Bennett used the inhaler, precious medicine going into his starved lungs. Color slowly came back to his face as his breathing started to get steady. Each controlled breath in was watched by Robert with medical accuracy, even as he kept complete control over Freddy. Pete moved towards the crowd, but Robert's voice stopped him cold. 3 steps back, hands where I can see them." The command allowed no argument, and Pete found himself obeying before he could think about it. 8 years, Special Forces. Robert spoke calmly, his grip never changing. 2 tours in Afghanistan, 1 in Iraq. This uniform isn't a fancy dress. It's a reminder that some of us still stand ready. His fingers tightened a little on Freddy's throat. "Ready to defend those who served before us from lowlifes like you." Police whistles cut through the evening air as palace security finally got there, but Robert's control of the situation never changed. His stance stayed pure military as he efficiently passed Freddy to the police officers, his movements so precise they could have been a training exercise. "The gentleman requires medical care," Robert told the arriving officers, his voice carrying parade ground authority. "And these 2 need to be dealt with for assault, stealing medical supplies, and attacking a veteran on palace grounds." His eyes met Freddy's with cold disapproval. "I'll be making a full statement." The police quickly secured Freddy and Pete, their handcuffs closing with a sound that echoed across the courtyard. Freddy's earlier false bravery had gone, replaced by helpless anger as he was led away. His attempts to threaten legal action were met with cold professionalism from officers who had seen the whole thing. Attacking a veteran, stealing medical kit, threatening behavior on palace grounds. The senior officer listed the charges, each one taking more color from Pete's face. The Crown takes these things very seriously, gentlemen, especially with the Queen's Guard as a witness. Paramedics had come to look after Mr. Bennet, but the veteran refused their offers of going to hospital once his breathing was steady. His soldier's bearing had come back with his oxygen, shoulders straight despite the evening's trouble. The torn place where his RAF badge had been seemed to blame Freddie as he was led past. "You'll be hearing from the Crown Prosecution Service," the officer told the arrested pair. "I expect they'll be very interested in your thoughts on old soldiers and palace security." His tone suggested this wouldn't be a quick legal matter. Freddie's face twisted with anger as he was guided towards the waiting police car. "This isn't finished!" he shouted, pulling against the handcuffs. "You can't—" "Yes, it is finished," the officer cut him off flatly, very definitely. The police car door closed on any more protests, finally ending the evening's disturbance. Mr. Bennet stood slowly, helped by a paramedic, but keeping his pride. His eyes met Guard Roberts for a moment, a look between soldiers that didn't need words. Decades of service, giving things up, and understanding passed between them in that quiet exchange. The old soldier straightened his coat, his dignity returning with every steady breath. Without talking, he stood to attention and gave Guard Robert a perfect salute. The guard returned it with perfect military form, the action carrying more meaning than any words could. "Your service is not forgotten, sir," he said quietly. "Not by those who know its value." After that, Guard Robert went back to his watch. His posture was exactly as rules demanded, his eyes looking straight ahead. But now, there was no mistaking the fighter behind the ceremony. Meanwhile, Freddie and Pete disappeared into the legal system, their false bravery crushed under the weight of Crown prosecution, their names added to a long list of those who learnt too late that some traditions have steel beneath their ceremony. What would you have done in Guard Robert's place? How long would you have waited before stepping in? Let us know your ideas in the comments below. Do you think traditional formal roles like the Queen's Guard still have a purpose in our modern world? Share your view with our community. If this story affected you, and you believe in keeping respect for our old soldiers and traditions, don't forget to hit that like button. It helps spread these important messages to more people who need to hear them. Subscribe to our channel for more strong stories about the Royal Guards, who stand as living symbols of dignity, duty, and firm dedication. These aren't just men in formal uniforms. They're highly trained soldiers who represent the best tradition of military service.